Hey, my name's Andy. You are listening to the Fishhawk Murders. This is the true story of murders that happened in my small town when I was a boy. On episode 2, we learned Justin Johnson and his family's murders were unrelated, and local man Sonny Minhas goes on the run with the drug dealer's money. Back to the investigation. The details of the deal the suspects in county jail made becomes common knowledge to the residents of Fishhawk. Everyone knows that the couple was not considered suspects in the family's murders. Although the state did believe the couple's self-defense story, officials are not prepared to let them out of jail yet. The couple is a flight risk. They sit in jail awaiting a potential trial. The police still have nothing to go on, no leads to follow, just a cold case. The town remains paralyzed with fear and suspicion. Law enforcement is embarrassed. The local news moves on. Nearby towns forget about it. Only the people of Fishhawk remember. At election time, the long-sitting county sheriff steps down due to the unsolved case. The town loses all confidence in law enforcement. Townspeople are afraid a killer will strike at any time and go unpunished. We all believe it will never be solved. Until one day in 2009 in Hackleburg, Alabama, a 38-year-old named Christopher Donald Baxter has been arrested for the murder of 42-year-old Sherry Jones Parker and her 16-year-old daughter Brittany Lynn Parker. Chris dated Sherry for a short time about a year before she was murdered. She had met him at a comedy club in Tuscaloosa in 2008. Sherry's friend said she and Chris hit it off pretty good. She liked him a lot at first. He is a stand-up comic, and he made her laugh. Chris lived across the border in Tennessee, but would drive to see Sherry often. After a couple months of dating, Sherry's friend said Sherry reported Chris as being kind of odd, and she broke it off with him. Apparently, Chris had a really weird and dark sense of humor, and he would often joke about having really rough sex and even hurting people. Sherry said his sense of humor was dry, and she really could never tell if he was joking or not. When they were dating, Chris would stay with Sherry for a few days or up to a week at a time. He spent a lot of time on her computer looking up stories about murders and murderers. He'd also go use the computers at the library near her home, often checking out the same kinds of books, unusual books, mostly about serial killers or crime stories. He said he used the books to help him with material for his comedy act. The final straw for Sherry was when he told a sexual joke about tying her daughter Brittany up. It sent chills down her spine. Chris's behavior in the bedroom began to get more unusual as well. Ultimately, the sum of all the weirdness made her break off the relationship. Her friend said that Sherry had told them that Chris still called her from time to time after they broke up, and his calls creeped her out. He often said he would drop by to see her unannounced. She asked him not to visit and to stop calling, but the calls still came. Apparently, Chris was not ready to let Sherry go. Like the Johnsons, Sherry lived with her daughter out in the country, on a country road with no neighbors close by. The Hackleburg Police Department did not catch Chris in the act of murdering Sherry. In fact, Chris was not arrested until several days after the bodies were found. On the night of August 12, 2009, according to Fire Chief Cam Alexander, Hackleburg Fire Department got the call alerting them to a fire at around 8:55 p.m. on a Wednesday night. The fire originated in the attached garage of the house. Nearby neighbors saw smoke coming up through the trees. They went to check on Miss Parker's house and saw it was engulfed in flames. Chief Alexander said 2 female bodies were found inside the home. The bodies were nearly unidentifiable. Sheriff's Department and county arson investigators worked to determine the cause of the fire and eventually positively identified the victims as Sherry and Brittany. Autopsies found that the bodies were deceased before the fire started and both women had suffered blunt object trauma to their bodies. Medical examiners were able to determine the bodies had been killed in the previous 24 hours before the fire. A murder investigation was opened and the Hackleburg PD began interviewing Sherry's family and friends. First, investigators spoke with Sherry's ex-husband, Michael Lee Parker, who was Brittany's father. Michael, who lived in the nearby town of Jasper, had an airtight alibi for the 2 days prior to the fire. He had been trying to contact his daughter Brittany for 3 days before the fire, without a response. Michael had been remarried for years, and it was said that he and Brittany's stepmom both had a good relationship with Sherry. Michael was not considered a suspect. Michael told police he had heard strange things about Chris. He was glad Sherry had broken it off with him, because he did not like him being around his daughter. Further implicating Chris was that one of Sherry's neighbors remembered seeing an orange truck with a camper shell parked on the road outside of Sherry's driveway earlier in the week. Police discovered that Chris Baxter drove a 2001 Amber Fire Pearl Coat Dodge Ram 1500 with a matching camper shell. Police went to Chris's home in Tennessee and to the Radio Shack where he worked part-time, and nobody had seen him. Chris had disappeared. Law enforcement got a warrant to search his home and put out an APB for his truck. Pictures of him and his truck were splashed all across the news in the South. If you happen to be familiar with this particular color of Dodge Ram, you'll know it sticks out. It did not take long to find Chris's truck. It was parked at a hotel in the small town of Millington, Tennessee. It's just outside of Memphis. The hotel clerk recognized the man and the truck that he had checked in earlier that day. He called the police, and when they busted into Chris's room, they found him sleeping. He was taken into custody and his truck was impounded. Chris was driven back to Alabama and questioned by the detectives working the murder investigation. When police questioned Chris, he had a 2-inch cut on his right hand and scratches on his arms and face. Chris told the police he had gotten the cuts and scratches in a bar fight on Beale Street in Memphis a few days before. Officers remember that Chris acted as if he did not have a care in the world. He seemed to be at ease and was telling jokes to the police officers. It was as if he was doing his stand-up routine for them. He said he had not seen Sherry in a few months and offered very little else on the topic. Even though a couple of days had passed since the fire was set, the tire tracks on the dirt road where an orange truck was seen were still there and were a match with the tread on Chris's truck. Chris was the main suspect for the murders, and the witness who saw his vehicle and the matching tire tracks was enough to hold him in custody. In 2009, forensics testing turnaround times could take anywhere from 30 days to a year. In this case, the Alabama Law Enforcement Agency is able to expedite and match Chris's DNA with DNA found in Sherry's home in a record 26 days. Investigators know that Sherry had put up a fight, and the cut on Chris's hand bled onto areas of her home that the fire did not damage. Chris is on the hook for the murders. He is informed of the evidence mounting up against him. In Alabama, capital punishment is a legal penalty for first-degree murder. The state has the highest per capita capital sentencing rate in the United States. In some years, its courts impose more death sentences than Texas, a state that has a population 5 times as large. Chris's lawyer informs Chris that it is highly likely he will be convicted and sentenced to death. Chris is eager to know if the state would offer him a lesser sentence in exchange for information about other murders that he knows about. The state prosecutor, John Stevenson, figures Chris is continuing with his wannabe stand-up routine. Mr. Stevenson is not entertaining making any deals with this small-time comic. The state is going to need Chris to give them some extraordinary information to discuss taking the death penalty off of the table. The state prosecutor says he honestly never expected to get anything significant from the comic/Radio Shack worker. When Chris hears from his lawyer what the state prosecutor said, he is offended. He goes back to his cell and sulks for 2 days. The prosecution believes Chris has accepted his fate and is done joking about trying to strike a deal. On the 3rd day, Chris calls his lawyer and says he wanted to give the state some information about a murder to make a deal. Chris tells his lawyer he has information to share about a family named Johnson who were murdered in Fishhawk, Florida in 2007. So who is Christopher Baxter? It's possible that some of you may already be familiar with Chris Baxter. In fact, if you live in the southern United States, you may have even paid money to see him perform. Chris was a stand-up comedian, not a household name comic, but he worked steady traveling the comedy circuit in the South. In 2007, Chris had been doing comedy for about 12 years. Chris was raised by his mother in Memphis and never knew his father. His father met his mother while attending training for the Navy in Tennessee. His father knew Chris's mom had gotten pregnant, but didn't care. When he was finished with his military training, he left and was never heard from again. Chris and his mom did not have an easy life. They depended on her relatives a lot for support and lived on welfare and subsidized housing for years. Chris was not a good student and often got in trouble for fighting at school. Chris's mom worked as a secretary for a roofing company and saved up enough money to buy a single-wide trailer. She moved the trailer to Chris's uncle Ron's property in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. Ron owned a Radio Shack store. Over the years, Chris's mom had grown obese and she had severe health problems. She passed away from breathing and heart complications when Chris was in his 20s. He inherited a little bit of money and the trailer they lived in, which allowed him to travel and live on the small amount of money comics earn. He also worked at the Radio Shack part-time that his uncle owned. Chris had been working there since high school. When he was in town and not on the road, he would run the store for his uncle. Chris is 5'10" with blonde hair, blue eyes, and a normal build. Chris did not have any close friends. People who knew him in passing usually thought of him as a nice guy. He was always trying to get laughs from customers at the store. Chris took medication for obsessive-compulsive disorder. His uncle said Chris had always resented that his dad abandoned him. He was really competitive and always acted like he had to prove himself. After Chris's mom died, he went through a change for the worse. He really kept to himself and became secretive and more resentful. He never shared anything about his personal life, and his uncle said he knew better than to ask. He said when Chris set his mind on something, it was all he could think about. He would watch comedy DVDs for hours a day. He'd often get pissed and proclaim himself to be way better than the comics and the videos, and the headliners he worked with. Chris complained a lot because he had never scored a billing as a headliner. Chris's uncle finished by saying that he never understood why a man so upset got into stand-up comedy. It did not make a lot of sense to him. Most people agreed that he did have talent, but he was also known to be a bully on stage. A lot of his act was crowd work, making fun of audience members. He was also known to go overboard. Other comedians at the time just thought of him as a heater, a guy who comes out and warms up the crowd for the main act. Chris's onstage bullying once led to violence and got him into trouble with the law. He was arrested for simple battery after putting a drunken heckler in the hospital after one of his shows in Atlanta. He only had to pay a fine for the misdemeanor charge. Other comics remember Chris as a guy who kept to himself. He did not travel or spend a lot of time with the other performers while on the road. He preferred to work clubs in the South so he could drive his own truck to the shows. Chris was no stranger to Florida. He had performed across the state many times. In August of 2007, Chris was the opening act at a comedy club called Teasers in Tampa. He was scheduled to perform the 3rd to the 5th, Friday to Sunday, and not expected to show up for his next show in St. Augustine, Florida until the following Friday. This did put him in the Fishhawk area on the week of the Johnsons' murder. The Alabama State Prosecutor has detectives look into the Johnson family murder, and detectives call the Tampa FBI and tell them they have a stand-up comic in custody for murdering his ex-girlfriend, and is claiming he has information about the still open Johnson case. The FBI sends Brendan Hunter, an agent familiar with the Johnson case, to Alabama to meet with Chris to make sure whatever he claims to know is legitimate. So far, all law enforcement is able to confirm is that Chris Baxter could have been in the Fishhawk area at the time of the murders, but they need more, a lot more. Agent Hunter needs Chris to tell them something that only someone familiar with the murders would know. He needs to provide information that was not released to the public. In the case of this horrific murder, there were a lot of details still unreleased. Chris is adamant about not giving too much information about the murder until he has a signed deal. But the detective needs him to give them something before even discussing a deal. Chris tells them he will provide a little information, and if that is not enough to make a deal, then he wouldn't tell them anything more. He also states that if they make the deal, he will tell them a lot more. It's up to them to decide. I have interviewed Agent Hunter several times for this podcast, and he told me that Chris's eyes glazed over when he spoke about the murder, like he changed into a different human. Agent Hunter saw Chris through a two-way mirror tell the detectives that the little Johnson girl who was upstairs in her room at the end of the hall had been beaten so badly in the head with a ballerina trophy that the trophy had broken and a piece of it got stuck in her face. Then Chris laughs and says, "What'd you want me to do? I'm not a doctor." The Alabama detectives are taken aback and speechless. Chris perks up and smiles. He seems to be pleased with himself at the thought of causing discomfort in the two men. The detectives step out of the interrogation room and enter the observation room where Agent Hunter is. A teary-eyed detective says he can't imagine any little girl might have suffered that kind of trauma. Agent Hunter is teary-eyed as well. The detective asks him if the detail is true. Agent Hunter nods his head and says yes, it's true. He's our man. Everyone's perspective on the no-name comedian shifts in an instant. Chris is taken back to his cell, and the Alabama State Prosecutor is left with a decision to make regarding Chris's life. While the prosecution deliberates the idea of making a deal with this horrible human, Chris leaks through his lawyer that he also has information related to other unsolved murders. Chris is willing to waive his 5th, 6th, and 14th Amendment rights and plead guilty to the murders of Sherry and Brittany Parker in exchange for life in prison. At that time, the FBI agent still had no viable leads on the Johnson murder and no way to connect Chris or anyone else to the murders. They are in favor of giving Chris the deal so they can give closure to the fishhawk community. Ultimately, the state of Alabama weighs the cost of putting Chris on trial, and all of the inevitable appeals he will likely pursue. He will likely be in prison most of his remaining life waiting on death row anyway. The state figures the benefits of making a deal with Chris are equal, if not better, than no deal at all. The state agrees and signs the deal. Chris's confession to the Johnson family murder gives zero doubt that he had been the murderer. His confession is accepted by the FBI, along with law enforcement agencies in Alabama. Chris Baxter, an unknown traveling stand-up comic, proved to be a psychopathic serial killer. He confesses to many other unsolved murders that occurred throughout the South over a 15-year period. Chris eventually told detectives what the doctor reference meant. It was taken from a quote from his favorite comedian, Lenny Bruce. The quote is, "I'm not a comedian, and I'm not sick. The world is sick, and I'm the doctor." His front as a stand-up comic was the perfect cover. No one ever expected him to be killing the very people he tried to make laugh. Chris killed indiscriminately. There was no demographic profile. He liked to hunt at night on country roads in small towns. Chris's motives included anger, thrill-seeking, and often involved sexual contact with the victims. This podcast does not cover Chris's other murders. As I said, I only wanted to tell the story of what happened in my town. Chris was charged and convicted of the killing of the 4 Johnson family members, and the case was finally closed. We normally think of a comic as someone who makes us laugh, someone who makes you feel better, to help us forget about our troubles. I don't think any of us could have guessed that there was a traveling psychopathic comic serial killer who was hunting and killing people after his shows. We cannot understand the mind of a serial killer, why they must hurt others. Morality means nothing to psychopaths. Their brain is malnourished, unhealthy if you will. They cannot process information like most people do. For whatever reason, one side of Chris Baxter likes to make people laugh and to please them, and another side enjoys hurting, torture, and murdering those same people. We will never understand what makes a man like that tick. We can all breathe a little easier and take solace knowing he is in prison for life and he won't have another chance to hurt any more innocent people. The family who died paid the ultimate price, and the rest of us, we lost our innocence and our belief that the world is safe and good. When decent people see the reality of what truly evil humans are capable of, it shocks them to their core. We now know there is always an element of evil lying in wait, and it can come in any form. Once the truth of the murders came out, my fellow townspeople were finally able to begin the healing process. We began to trust our neighbors again and believe in the goodness that so many of us embody. If you take anything away from this podcast, please don't let it be a distrust of entertainers or comics. The rest of us need to continue being good, decent, loving humans who stay vigilant. Before I end this podcast, I want to follow up on Sonny Minhas and the couple arrested for Justin Johnson's murder. The couple, Liliana Beltran and Gabriel Morales, stayed in jail awaiting trial until the killer Chris Baxter was caught and confessed. Law enforcement determined that the pair had likely acted in self-defense. Obtaining a conviction indicating otherwise was not guaranteed. The couple was released from jail, but not before the FBI warned them to not make any attempt to go after whoever relieved them of those duffel bags. Sonny Minhas, he was the young man who relieved them of their money. His whereabouts are still unknown. I heard he was last seen in Alaska. Law enforcement had stopped looking for him and only had ever needed him to testify as a witness. Even if I did know where he was, the details of Sonny's eventual fate are a story best left for another time. The end. If you like this content, please follow, share, review, or tell a friend about it.